So, David, glad to have you. You are both a YouTuber and a landscape photographer. I've seen you cover Luminar a lot. I know that you love to travel. Tell us some of the reasons why you're so passionate about landscape and nature.
I think landscape and nature for me is kind of an escape. When people say I'm a photographer, everybody expects you to be out in the field all the time, and especially if you tell them you're a nature photographer, they expect you to be hitting the trails, putting in 10 miles every single day. It's not the reality. I still use landscape and nature photography is really an escape. When you're doing it full time, it's still your hobby. Shooting is still your hobby, and you spend a lot of the time working in your office, like where I am now, is where I spend the majority of my time. But it's still just a fun activity for me. And I'm passionate about the places that I go to photograph, whether that be for conservation reasons or working with the Nature Conservancy, or just going to local places in Tennessee, North Alabama,
Mhm.
Southern Kentucky, and even making some trips out west.
Yeah, you've got some beautiful mountains down there that are really quite nice, which is awesome. So, what do you want to show us today? What sort of things have you brought to tell us?
So, first, I want to talk about actually getting out into a location and photographing without any expectations. It's a big problem that I think a lot of people struggle with when
Yeah.
they first get into landscape and nature photography. So, I want to talk about that and show you a couple examples of that as well. And then I want to show you my bread and butter is really waterfall photography. And I was just recently up in a really cool waterfall location, and I want to take you through some steps of how you can actually edit some waterfall images specifically using Luminar AI and what tools you can look at to really bring out some of those fine details. Because I think waterfall photography and a lot of the genres of nature photography kind of stand alone in some of the specific tools you can use to bring out the details.
I think that sounds awesome, and you hit on two things there that I think a lot of people who want to do landscape and nature photography struggle with. Like, so much of landscape photography is beyond your control. You get up at the right time of day, you hike those 5 miles, and despite what the weather report said, the sky never clears or the
Yeah.
dramatic sunset never happens. But with waterfalls, not saying they're totally predictable, but water keeps flowing, and I don't want to say it's easy because it's not, but it's a little more controllable. So if you take the time to master how to shoot them and how to edit them, you could get consistently good results. From most waterfalls. Sure, you got to learn composition. You got to learn how to properly configure your camera, and I'm sure you've got some tools that you use to control your exposure. But it's a much more controllable thing than say, I want that beautiful sunset.
Exactly. And that's probably why I flock to them so much is because they're much less frustrating, but they're
Good.
also fun. Like you can look at different seasonality. If you're going to the same ones a lot during the year and multiple times a year, like I do, you kind of look at weather patterns and how much rain you get in specific times of year. And the water levels in waterfalls changes how they look. And you can photograph a lot of different little smaller scenes within them when the water level isn't so high that you're getting that gushing waterfall flowing over. So it's really fun to visit a lot of the same places over and over, especially when you're dealing with water, and trying to see what's different about them and how you can frame them up. Cloudy skies, you can shoot all day. If it's going to be sunny, you can get out there at sunrise or sunset or golden hour, about 2 hours before the sun goes down.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to get out of your way. We're looking forward to your presentation. I'll keep an eye on the Q&A and chat pod for you and occasionally give you some time cues, but thank you for joining us today and thank you for being willing to share your process.
Absolutely, absolutely. I want to share my screen first off and talk about some of those like expectations issues that you can kind of run into. I'm just going to hit present real quick here. Think you guys can see this. So
Yep, it loaded.
I'm just going to back up here real quick. So if you've seen this photograph before, you probably know where this is. This is in Zion National Park. I actually just got back from a trip out to Zion and I was looking at this location and where do I go to photograph in Zion and what do I go to shoot there, because I had never been there before. And honestly, I relate places that you're going, kind of like culture shock. If you're going into a new location for the first time, it can be super overwhelming and kind of put your mind into overdrive when you're looking for compositions. So, one great thing to do is you can go to the popular spots, and that's what this is. This is the classic overlook shot of the Watchman, and you have the river kind of taking you directly to the Watchman Peak, which is right here. And it's easy to see why this is the most popular composition in Zion National Park. You can photograph sunrise here, you can photograph sunset here, you can photograph Milky Way. I mean, the Milky Way rises right behind that mountain in the early part of Milky Way season. So it's pretty obvious to see why people flock here. And you can see people lined up all across the bridge when you do go to this location. Even though there are signs that say don't stand on the bridge, people still do it. But I photographed this and I thought, I've seen this shot before, you know, and my expectations were to get this scene exactly how I wanted it to be. But something was lacking for me, and having that expectation of what the shot was going to look like for me made me struggle a little bit when I was thinking about this isn't my creation. This isn't my photograph. What else can I do here to frame it up in a good way that I like and still make it this iconic scene in Zion National Park? So I think it goes without saying that you can do your research when you're going into a park and find the areas that you want to shoot. But after you get that shot, kind of throw expectations to the side and throw to the side what you think you should be getting in a location and flock to something a little more your style. So I kind of crawled down the bank and got right next to the river and framed this up in a new way, waited for that sunlight to get really far down on the side of the Watchman. And I photographed this right in golden hour. The sun wasn't all the way down yet, but you get some really interesting rock textures. These tree roots were going all over the place in the foreground. And I think ditching expectations, ditching your plans allows you to think really like way outside the box when you're starting to work with iconic locations like this. Now, you also get ditched expectations when you get photographs like this. So if you're going straight to the Watchman in Zion National Park, you know, that's the only place you're looking to photograph. You expect to get there, you expect to get that shot. But when you go into it like this is just a photograph that I got along the side of the main road in Zion National Park. When you go into it with an idea of, you know what, it will be cool to get that shot. It'll be cool to photograph that in the right light. But what can I get along the way? Am I willing to give up that iconic shot that a lot of people have to get kind of my own interpretation of a location, my own interpretation of a natural scene in Zion? And I photographed this tree that was just budding out in spring, and you have this bigger tree behind it with evergreen on it, and it puts that contrast against one over the other, old versus new, established versus just growing. And then, I mean, Zion everywhere, you have these amazing rock textures going through the background of your scene. So it's always fun to photograph scenes like this. And then, even further, ditching expectations of Zion National Park. So, what I noticed when I was here, I was photographing this scene actually, and I started to see storm clouds building behind me and kind of off to the southeast of Zion National Park. And I said, you know what? Am I willing to give up an entire national park that I came to visit? And the answer was yeah, because when you start chasing storms, you get some pretty interesting cloud cover like you do here. So, this is an old, gnarly, scraggly tree against some crazy storm clouds that were going on in the background, and switching this over into black and white and just pulling out tons of contrast and tons of detail within that tree and what makes it so interesting and scraggly. And then pinning that against a storm behind it just makes a really good black and white photograph. And there's so many thoughts from people about, hey, you probably hiked miles to get this shot. my truck is literally parked right behind me. I'm on the side of an interstate, and there are tractor trailers going right behind me. So this wasn't the most peaceful shot to photograph, but it was one of the most epic storm clouds that I've ever photographed in the desert Southwest, with kind of this shrubbery and the foliage that you typically get in the desert Southwest too. Expectations can be the same for desert locations. I went to some Bureau of Land Management area, BLM land as it's called, and photographed some other rock striations in the landscape. And it's really interesting. This is probably one of the most popular compositions you can get in the location that I went to here. And you just get these white lines along the red rocks. And then at a certain elevation, there's a drastic shift between red and white. And photographing that in golden hour, allowing the light to illuminate and sidelight all of these rocks, makes for some great textures. And it just reminded me of like some interesting clouds in the red sky in the evening, and then all the white is this tumultuous sea down below it. So I like to make up stories for my photographs too, and create some interesting compositions there. Now, how do expectations work in with that? Well, this is the classic composition that you can get here. It's what everybody flocks here to see and to shoot. So how do you think differently about that? Well, I photographed this for sure, but as I waited, I watched the sunlight kind of change how the landscape was appearing, and everybody was pointing their cameras in this direction, but nobody pointed their cameras or looked behind them. And what was going on behind them was this. And probably one of the most epic light casts I've ever seen on a landscape just highlighted this area of hoodoos in the Utah desert perfectly. And I think that goes in with these expectations. You know, we see all these images on social media that we want to go to these locations for, but when we're so fixated on capturing that same image that we've seen and have that expectation of conditions and location and composition, we need to instead start looking around at what the light is doing in the landscape, what's happening all around us. And it was really, it made me laugh because I just kept shooting this and watching the light cast on this landscape. And eventually I said to everybody in there, hey, look behind us. There's some pretty cool stuff going on in the background. So it was
To
fun.
that end, David, I want to add a comment to what you were sharing there, because I do a lot of time lapse photography,
Yeah.
and so I usually bring 4 or 5 cameras with me in the field, because like once it's running, then I need it, and I can't touch that camera. But
Yeah.
I actually learned a technique from Elia the other day, and you probably do something similar, which is he told me, oh look, I use the interval timer too, and once I find the angle, I just keep letting it shoot, because as the light keeps changing, sometimes it gets more amazing. And so he taught me about this idea of committing to the shot rather than like taking one and then wasting time hunting for another, because the light might be getting better. So, you saw something over there, and then you like stopped looking over there and just looked around. You're like, that's cool too. And so
Yeah.
is that. So you can't get so obsessed in one direction.
Yeah, that's so true. And time lapse, like you do commit to it. You're fixated on it for sure.
And that's why I
Having
bring multiple cameras.
you have to. And it's one of the cool things you can do with that too, is having like your time lapse on a wide angle lens, and then having your 70 to 200 or something like that stuck
Yeah,
on your second camera body.
absolutely.
And I'm a little bit scatterbrained in the field, so I'm always like, ooh, what's going on over there? And
Yeah, and then you take out your smartphone when those cameras are busy, and yeah,
yeah.
you're just looking around. Well,
Yeah.
excellent. So you've got some editing techniques now with waterfalls you're going to show us next, or what are you going to do next?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to
Awesome.
share my Luminar screen with you guys and show you exactly what I'm doing with that. So here we are in Luminar. Just going to minimize this for me. So here's a waterfall shot. This is one of those examples that I was talking about when water levels get low. Behind this is probably a 50-foot waterfall. and the water levels were low on it. So I kind of fixated on this smaller scene down below it. And
Now,
it's
before
really,
you jump right into the editing,
uh
because
huh,
I know it's second nature to you, but there's a lot of folks here who don't do landscape photography. Could
sure.
you just briefly explain why your water looks nothing like the water they see when they get into their shower in the morning?
Yeah, you mean the longer exposures here?
Yes, yeah, that's the part that a lot of folks don't understand. Like, just talk about like if there's any camera gear you're using or any camera settings, because that's one of those in-camera tricks. It was like the first time when Vanelli and I were traveling together internationally, I took him to a museum and we screwed on the ND filter and dialed everything down. And I took shots at a museum and all the people disappeared. And we had this, it looked like we had the museum to ourselves.
Yeah,
And he's like, "How'd you do that?" Because he's a portrait guy. And I'm like, "Dude, this is like common landscape trick." But what I tell is, "Ooh, it's magic." And
yeah,
we laughed
exactly.
about it. But explain the magic here. Because if you've never done this, it's really seems difficult, but it's not, right? Like this is just a matter of thinking through time.
Exactly, exactly. And you have to think about it in terms of settings and what you want to accomplish with your water. So, what I was using a kind of medium range lens here. I was using a medium format Fuji camera, and I was photographing with a medium lens, probably something like a 50 millimeter. Would get you. And then I was using a circular polarizer. So that's the one filter that I always recommend to people for waterfall photography, because as you spin it, you can take glare off of certain areas, hence why you can see through the water over here on the left side. And as you take it off certain areas, you can put more gloss from the wet parts of the waterfall on other areas, which is why you can see some of this reflected light on the rocks over here. So you balance that filter and get it just right. But I always tell people, if you're struggling with waterfall photography for the first time, just put it on f16, ISO 100, and balance your exposure to it. I try to get my exposure right at the point where you can see the movement of the water. So something like half a second to 1 second, but you can still see that water detail in like kind of the outflow, and you can see where that water is traveling to, which complements the composition. And you can use an ND filter to do this, but you're going to get more of like a 2, 3, 4 second exposure when you do that, depending on how dark your ND filter actually is on the entire image that you're creating. So that's kind of the trick of the trade here. You definitely need a tripod when you're photographing long exposures with waterfalls too. So I'm using a Gitto tripod when I'm doing this too, which holds a ton of weight, which what I typically have on my ball head that I'm photographing with in the field. And I just like this composition overall because you can follow this rock swirl over all the way to the waterfall, and then that outflow detail that you can follow over here, and this rock detail down below. Using the circular polarizer, you can see the rock detail down below, and it brings you back. So your cyclical composition is always something great to have in your photography, especially with waterfalls, because there's so much movement. You want to complement that movement in your composition too. So just getting this edit started off, I always go to enhance AI, and I just play around with this because it does so much with contrast and clarity, and just some of the fine details in your waterfall, and works with those highlights and shadows. Now, when I start working with things like enhance AI, we can work with light and getting that exactly how I want it. This is a little bit dark, so I'm going to brighten it up just slightly and use some smart contrast to dial down the shadows and bring up some of the highlights too, and create some more contrast in.
And I just want to explain the difference for folks between
Mhm,
regular contrast and smart contrast. If you could
mhm.
rock that a little bit left and right, it actually is a really cool tool because normally contrast changes color, and this lets you change exposure without shifting color. And it can be used to open or close up your shadows without destroying the image. So it's so much better than a regular contrast or an aggressive curve. Most people hear contrast are like, oh, that's a total beginner's tool. But smart contrast is kind of like contrast version 6. So it's a
Yeah,
pretty useful tool.
yeah, exactly. And thank you for bringing that up. Like you can see it like Richard was talking about, as we pull this up and down, just how much it kind of it maintains the shadows and highlights that you're working with, which I think is really beneficial here. I am going to cool this off just a little bit because it kind of evokes this cool scene. So temperature, I'm just going to bring it down a little bit to the blue side because the water is a little bit blue, and down here you get some teal tones. And you do get a little bit of magenta popping out on these rocks over here as well. So once I get to kind of like this point in my editing process, I always look at my image and think, okay, what do I want people to look at? What do I want them to see? And that's how I approach the rest of my editing process within this. So if I want people to see the waterfall specifically, having that as my main subject, I also have secondary subjects of these rocks and tertiary or third subjects as the rocks down below the water surface that you can see thanks to the circular polarizer. I kind of want to go in that order. What do I want to see? What do I want people to see first, second, and third? So the next thing I want to jump over to is structure AI, and just basically put a little bit more structure and get some more fine details out of this. And what I like to do with this is pull it up, and you can see how much detail, texture almost it puts on some of this area of the waterfall. What I like to do is pull it up, and then I gently bring it back down to a point where I'm like, okay, I'm satisfied. That's kind of what I saw in the field. So something around like 19 or 20.
Yeah, and for those of you who are used to clarity,
Mm,
structure is like clarity, but the difference here is you'll notice that even as David cranked it up, it didn't add weird noise to the water. So
mm.
it's trained to ignore water and sky and skin tones so you could be more aggressive on other parts of your image. So instead of clarity that you then have to erase on half your image, it's clarity with a smart mask. And we call that structure because it's unique.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's one of the problems with clarity. Like I always tell people, don't go above 20 with clarity, but AI structure, you can kind of pull it up to extensive levels and you're still not breaking up your composition and breaking up the natural look of your image as well. Next up, we have color. Color, obviously, you can add saturation and vibrance. I think the saturation and vibrance in this image looks really good. What I like to do to kind of get more fine tuning on my specific colors is go to these HSL sliders down here, and you can go to your hue, saturation, and luminance by clicking this drop down menu. I'm going to go to saturation first because I don't want to mess with any of the hues that are going on in here because it looks right to me. And I want to look at this down here below the surface of the water where you get some cyan in there, some blue and cyan. So I'm just going to pull that up slightly, maybe pull up some greens just a little bit on that saturation. And because, I am getting some more blue in here and in the water specifically, since there is some blue in cyan, I'm just going to balance that out by pulling the saturation of my blues down. And then maybe if there's any magenta, pulling that up just a little bit. And there's some speckled leaves on here. So I'm just going to pull up my red and orange saturation in that too. And that's pretty good. Now, remember, I talked about what do I want people to see? I want them to be attracted to the waterfall first. So if I go to my luminance of my colors, I mentioned that these were a little bit blue. What I can do is come down here to my blue slider for my luminance, and I can just pull that up gently to just a little bit. And that looks good right there, having just a little bit more blue luminance in my edit overall. So I think that looks pretty good with my colors, just very slight tweaks. And that's kind of what I like to do with a lot of my editing. And then what I'm going to do is come down here to this professional section, and I'm going to do some dodging and burning. I think dodging and burning is one of my favorite things to do to bring detail and bring attention to specific parts of my image. So remember, I want first, second, and third subjects being highlighted in that order. So I'm going to get a brush size that's pretty good size, probably about, let's go down to around 75, something like that. My softness, I'm going to have all the way up because I don't want people to see where that hard edge is. As you see, that feathering as I get down to 0 becomes like non-existent. I want to have that pulled up all the way to 100 because that gently blends this effect into the image. And then strength, I am just going to pull this down to something like 15. And that's just making sure that these are very minute adjustments because these can go overboard pretty quick. I just want to really lighten very seclusive parts of this. So I'm going to pull my strength actually down to 10. And because I'm on lighten, I'm going to work with what I want to lighten in the image. So I'm just going to paint in lighten on the waterfall itself. And you can already see just in that, it jumped out a little bit more than everything else. Now, what I'm going to do, since I just brightened that a little, I think the rocks are a good secondary brightness right now because they stand out, but they don't stand out as much as the water. So what I'm going to do is going to go over here to darken, and I'm going to work on this water down below here to darken that up so you don't get so much attention pulled to that part of the water. So I'm going to go to darken, have the same brush size pretty much. I can have it a little bit bigger because I'm working with a bigger area. Softness all the way up, and then strength I'm going to pull back down to about 10 so you guys can see this. Sometimes I work with like a 5 strength, and then I'll make another adjustment on top of it and work with that. So I'm just darkening this little area right here, just kind of removing some of that attention from this water down below. And you can see that it does a good job of keeping that detail there and keeping the exposure overall for the image intact. But I'm just maybe bringing up the exposure of certain areas and bringing down the exposure of other certain areas, which you can do in a mask as well. But I really like the dodge and burn tool and using that in there as well.
Yeah, and
And then
you could build that up by using that lower opacity. You can keep brushing over the
exactly.
same area to add or subtract. Then you've always got the global strength slider on it that you could pull down if it get the amount slider if it gets too intense. So
That's
that's a
exactly
great
right.
tool.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
and David, a lot of folks don't know this. Could you open that tool up for 1 second? Because there's a
Sure.
cool shortcut that people wouldn't know. And that's when you're using any of the brush tools. If you could put your mouse over the canvas, just show them the left and right bracket. And
Yes.
it's going to change the size of the brush. And then if you use the option left and right bracket, it's going to change the hardness or the softness of the brush, or maybe it's shift. I can't remember. But there are cool shortcuts that you could use to change those, so you don't have to keep going back and forth between tool and canvas.
Yeah, that's a really good point and a really good shortcut. I love shortcut keys, so that's always beneficial.
Yeah, and if you
Um,
guys open up the user manual, we actually have a whole section with all the shortcut keys listed. So I'll put that into the chat area for folks.
Perfect. Last thing I always do is maybe kind of find something within here that I do want to create a mask on. So what I'm going to do is actually add a little bit of contrast, a little bit of warmth, and a little bit of the structure AI, just very minimal there. And what I'm going to do is paint a mask into here. And I'm going to do this to try just to bring the detail to that waterfall specifically. So I'm just painting in where I want that to be, bringing up just a slight more of the structure, the warmth, and the contrast into just the waterfall. And the masking, the very simple masking, in other softwares takes hours to do if you're not familiar with how to do it. But this, as you can see, just the water, it brought out that much detail in the water overall. So that's what I like to do with that.
That's
So that's
awesome. Yeah. And I love you're really pointing out, and I think it's interesting because with landscape photography and landscape painting, it's many of the same things. And that's why you keep using these brush tools because it allows you to brush in a little bit more or to subtract from areas. Because what we're really doing is painting with light. You're bringing out shadows and highlights and colors. And what you've really done here, just so folks could see it, could you toggle between the before and after up there at the top, like, or the split screen, either way? I just
Yep.
wanted to see how much you've really changed those colors and the dynamic range. It's a lot. It's subtle. It's not overdone, but it's very deliberate. And it goes from being a well shot photo with good color to a well shot photo with interesting dynamic range that pulls you in and makes your eye want to work its way through the picture.
Yeah, and I think the most important word that I could use is kind of what you said: subtle but deliberate. I'm very I'm very deliberate about where I want that to be in my images, and it's subtly there. And I really like the way that it works with that, which is one of the reasons that Luminar AI is a great tool to use.
Awesome. Well, David, that was great advice. People were really enjoying this, and I know they loved hearing from you. Where can people go to learn more from you? And I know you have content on YouTube. I'm pretty sure you have a blog. If you got some links, put them in the chat pod for folks. But where can they learn more from you?
Yeah, if people go to my website, you can go to davidjohnstonart.com, and you can find all the links to like my social media. I think I'm David Johnston Photo on a lot of the social media outlets. And then I have a podcast called The Landscape Photography Show that people can go to and listen. I interview a lot of the best photographers all over the world, and we talk shop, we talk about what makes them tick. And then other than that, my YouTube channel, if you just search David Johnston Photography, I'll probably come up, but I'm on there under that name. And I have a lot of fun kind of doing some behind the scenes videos on that, and also doing some editing tips. Like you said, I review Luminar stuff and show you some stuff in there. And then just kind of have fun along the way. Like I recently did a video with my baby strapped to the front of me to see if I could actually photograph spring flowers. So that was a challenge.
Nice, nice. Well, thank you for sharing your passion and for letting folks see how you think. And that's what a lot of folks commented on. We actually are running a poll right now where people talk about, what they struggle with. And it's as I suspected. You guys are going to see the results here soon. But right now, when we ask people, what do you find hardest about taking a photo? It's not the editing, although I think that's partially because you're all here using Luminar. It's actually not getting the camera settings right. The number one thing you all find hardest is coming up with the idea. And that's what you shared here. You talked about looking around differently and looking for things and looking in a different direction. You know, being willing to not get the same shot that everyone else gets and go, you know what, I'm willing to try something different. Let me go find a different angle. So that was great. I really appreciate you sharing that. So many folks are saying the same thing. So if you have a moment, David, take a look at the chat pod and the Q&A. You might see some things you want to respond to. And thank you again for joining us today. We really appreciate you coming.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for having me. I had a blast sharing this. It was great.